AFR Talk.
Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Joshua Du Bois, the former director of the White House for President Obama's Faith Initiative, saying, look, we are much closer to realizing the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. than the race baiters and the race mongers want us to believe. And Raul Labrador, who is Hispanic, saying, look, I am living proof that the American dream is still alive. It is still attainable. I was born to a single mom. I was born in circumstances that everybody would say attaining the American dream virtually impossible. But my mother was a single mom. She lost her job when she got pregnant with me. So, I mean, you talk about it being as disadvantaged as you possibly could be, not an English speaker. She was a Spanish speaker. She didn't have a job. She made the choice to give her son life, did not have him aborted. And she was determined to give her son a good life. And so she sent him to military school, not because they were rich, but because she sacrificed. She wanted him to get a good education. She made a point of sending him to a bilingual school because she believed that the only way he could be successful was by gaining an education and by learning English. Now, here's clip number 2. This shows you how committed she was to having her son learn English in order to be successful. And here he is today. He is a sitting United States congressman. He's one of the most visible and prominent members of the House of Representatives because of the immigration issue keeps coming up over and over again. And he's one of the first go-to guys for the media when it comes to immigration issues because of his Hispanic background. And here's what his mother said to him. And this touches on the issue of our insistence that people learn English, that as a part of assimilating to life in America, they learn English. We don't take this position because we don't like legal immigrants. We are for legal immigration. It is illegal immigration that we are against. We are for legal immigration. And those that legally immigrate to this country, we insist, it's our view, that they should be required to learn English, to become functional, to become fluent in English. Why? Because we want them to be able to succeed in their adopted home country. And the only way to succeed, the only way to flourish, the only way to prosper is to speak English because it is the language of communication in this country. It's the language of commerce. We want you to succeed. So we're insisting that you learn English, not because we don't like you, but because we do, because we want you to be able to experience the American dream just as we have. So here's what Raul Labrador's mom said to him, clip 2.
I remember when we moved to the United States, she told me something that was so significant in my life. She said, in private, we can speak Spanish, but when you're in public, you need to speak English because I want you to speak English to the best of your ability. These are things that she thought about. I spent the last 24 hours. I watched the Martin Luther King's speech 3 times over the last 24 hours, and it was fantastic. And the rhetoric that he used, the words that he used, and the message that he used was a message of hope. And unfortunately, what I've been hearing from your panelists is not a message of hope. It's a message of despair.
Well,
and I think we need our leadership
let me ask
to actually be more hopeful.
So that's Raul Labrador. We need to get away from the language of gloom and doom and despair and be more hopeful, to have the kind of hope in our conversation about race and culture, the same kind of hope that infused the speech of Martin Luther King Jr. Let's go to Keith in Memphis, Tennessee. Keith, welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher. What's on your mind?
Yeah. Hey, Brian, thanks for taking my call.
Yeah, you bet.
I hope my phone doesn't cut out. But you made a comment. It was for Christianity that really allowed for the civil rights movement to flourish. And I'm an African-American as well. I think it was I wouldn't give it a blanket statement. I would say the correct application of Christianity. As you well know, there was a large Christian slave trade that happened when it first started.
Mm-hmm.
Now, don't get me wrong. The greatest slave traders of the world is Islam. They started 1,000 years before Christianity, and they're still enslaving African people today. But it was a correct application of Christian or biblical principles that allowed it to happen. People started reading the Bible. They saw that the laws in the Old Testament of kidnapping people against their will, you were supposed to put the kidnapper to death.
Yes.
If slaves ran away in the Old Testament, they were allowed to live freely wherever they wanted to live in the land of Israel, and if you could not return them to their slave owners. See, if we just applied those laws back then, you never would have had a slave trade. But when people saw and started looking, especially the Christians in the South who said, this isn't right, because their lack of participation and the application of the correct principles allowed evil people who use the Bible to abuse and hurt people by selectively picking scriptures. That hurt people. It hurt the Christian movement, and it hurts them today. So we have to be honest about the misapplication back then that allowed that evil to go on, and then the people who began to speak up and say, hey, I'm a Christian, and this isn't right. I'm going to say, blacks are people. They're not animals. African Americans do deserve the same rights as everyone else. So that's the way I sort of look. I don't call myself a Christian. I call myself a biblical follower, because there are certain doctrines that I agree with and certain that I don't. But it was those applications, and I'm picking up my son right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Keith. Listen, I appreciate that very much. And, Keith is exactly right. In fact, the problems that we have, the fact that slavery became an institution in the United States was because we ignored the plain teaching of Scripture. Even in the Mosaic Code, there was a very explicit instruction that if anyone kidnapped a man in order to sell him, he was to be put to death. And if you were found in possession of a man who had been kidnapped and you had purchased him and therefore he was in your possession, you were to be put to death. That's from the Mosaic Code. A lot of people think, well, the Mosaic Code justified, sanctioned, protected slavery. Well, it protected two kinds of slavery. You can call them slavery if you want, but these were two kinds of slavery that we actually practiced in the United States, and they are benign forms. If you want to call them slavery, you can. That's the term that the Bible uses for them. But one form that was sanctioned in the Mosaic Code was in what we call indentured servitude. This is the way a lot of people came to America. They basically sold their labor to a master, if you want to use that term, for 7 years in exchange for passage to the New World. So they signed up with somebody who said, I will give you passage to the New World. I will give you a footprint in the New World, but you will need to serve me for 7 years to reimburse me. You can't afford to purchase passage yourself, so you can work off that debt to me for 7 years, and then you will be free to go. You will be a free man. And I think that concept of going free after 7 years, that comes right out of the Scriptures, because that was the longest that a Jew could have a fellow Jew in indentured servitude. Couldn't be any longer than 7 years because it was a matter of human dignity. So we got that concept from the Mosaic Code, that of indentured servitude. That became a means by which many people worked their way to America and got planted in America. The other kind of slavery, if you want to use that term, that was permitted was for prisoners of war. Now, we did the same thing in World War II. There was a time in the South, you had a lot of young American males from the South were off fighting Germany in Europe. We had a lot of German prisoners of war. What did we do with thousands of these German prisoners of war? We shipped them to the United States. We packed them on buses, and we sent them to the South, where they worked the fields until the war was over. They were prisoners of war. That was a form of slavery, if you want to use that term. It was a form of servitude because they weren't allowed to go wherever they pleased. So we've practiced the same kind of servitude and don't even realize that that's what we've done. But the kind of slavery, here's my point, the kind of slavery that was practiced in America, the kind of slavery that was practiced in America which is predicated on man-stealing, predicated on kidnapping a man and selling him into slavery, that was condemned both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. In fact, in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, it was a capital offense. If you kidnapped a man, which Muslims and Arab slave traders did, and a lot of Africans did, they would go in and kidnap members of different tribes with which they were at war. They would go into the interior of Africa, they would kidnap them, they would bring them to the coast, and they would sell them to white slave traders. Now, according to the Bible, what they did to the fellow denizens of the African continent was a capital offense. And what these white slave traders did when they purchased these slaves, that too was a capital offense. Both the African slave kidnapper and the white slave trader, if they had done what they did under the Mosaic Code, they both would have been put to death. That would have been a capital offense. And therefore, when the first boat bringing slaves, which came to America in 1619, when that first slave ship came, pulled into harbor in America, if the Bible had been followed, then the colonists would have turned that ship away, or they would have taken the slave trader off the ship and put him to death, and then made sure that there was somebody that could take these kidnapped victims back to freedom and slavery, or freedom from slavery in their homeland. So my point is, if the Bible had been followed, you never would have had the institution of slavery in the first place. That's in the book of Numbers. If you go to 1 Timothy 1, Paul talks there about the things that are appropriate for the law to sanction, for the law to punish, for the law to penalize. Slave trading is one of them. This is 1 Timothy 1:9. The things that the law is suitable for. It's appropriate to have laws for the sexually immoral, for men who practice homosexuality. So clearly, according to the New Testament now, according to the Apostle Paul, it is appropriate to have laws that criminalize homosexual behavior. That's a New Testament concept. It's embedded right there in 1 Timothy. That's a proper use of the law to have sanctions against men who practice homosexuality. The next category is enslavers. That is those who buy and sell men into slavery. That's a proper subject of the law. Paul says, according to the New Testament gospel, it ought to be against the law. If Christianity had been observed, there never would have been slavery in the United States of America.